Hey guys, today we're going to be working on a clock project. We're going to make a clock that looks just like this one. To start, I have ambrosia maple. It has really cool lines and colors in it, and it's just a really cool piece of wood. We also have purple heart, which is going to be used for the inlays on our clock sides. When I'm talking about the parts of the clock, I'm going to be referring to it as A, B, and C. A being the top and bottom, B being the next piece down, and C being the sides. The whole clock will be made out of ambrosia maple with purple heart inlays on part C. The center part is made out of beech plywood, and then of course we have our clock mechanism that goes from the back to the face of the clock. Let's get going. First, we're going to measure the thickness of our board so we can set the planer to the right measurement. We're going to be working our way down to 3/4 of an inch to start working on parts B and C, which are the thickest pieces on the clock. After using the planer, I like to follow up with sanding just to remove any tool marks. I usually start with 120 grit and move my way up to 240 grit. Next, we want to move on to the jointer so we can clean up one edge of the board and make it perfectly square to the other faces. Once we're finished using the jointer, we're going to go to the miter saw and rough cut our board to 16.5 inches, again working for parts B and C. Now we can take our 16.5 inch board over to the table saw and rip cut parts B and C. Part B is going to be 2 inches and part C is going to be 1.5 inches. Before we move any further with parts B and C, I'd like to catch up with part A. So now we're going to take this board to the planer. We left off at 3/4 of an inch, so now I want to take off about a 1/16 of an inch until I get down to 1/2 inch. Just like before, we're going to follow up with some sanding to remove any tool marks left behind by the planer. Now we can go back to the table saw and make a rip cut for part A. I really want to keep these lines, so I want to make sure I include them. Part A is going to be 2.5 inches wide. Now that we have parts A, B, and C, we can start cross-cutting these to length. We're going to start with part C, and we're going to cross-cut it to 4 3/4 inches. We're going to need 2 of each piece, so I'm going to make another 4 3/4 inch piece for part C. Now, for part B, I'm going to make 2 8-inch pieces. Again, for part A, I really want to keep these stripes here, so I'm going to make sure I include it in my 2 9-inch pieces for part A. Now we can make dados on the insides of part C. Since these pieces are a little small, we definitely want to use a featherboard and a push stick to do this. Choose what side you want to be your front and then set your fence to be 3/4 of an inch from the back of the piece. With the inside dados done now, we can move on to make the dados on the edges of part C. The edges are going to be on the face of the clock, and they're going to hold the Purple Heart inlays that we're going to make. Of course, we really want to make sure we're using our featherboard and push stick again, and we just want to make the same 1/8 inch dado as before. Except this time, the dado is going to be directly in the middle of the edge on part C. Now we can start on our Purple Heart inlays. I already had small pieces of Purple Heart left over from a past project, and I just cut them to 4 3/4 to match our part C. I'm going to put a little bit of glue in each groove, and then I'm going to clamp down the Purple Heart inlays inside them. Now we can let these dry and move on to routing parts A and B. For that, we're going to use the routing table. Here I have parts B and A, and I also have a backer block to help push the wood. We're going to start with part B, and we're going to start with the edge of part B. Right now I have the fence set to make about a half of a cut so that I'm not taking too much off at one time. I'll follow up and make the full cut in a second pass. Both pieces of part A and B are only going to be routed on 3 edges. With the first pass done on 3 edges of all 4 pieces, I'm going to move the fence back to make the rest of the route. This helps prevent chipping the wood from trying to take off too much wood at one time. Sometimes the end of the wood gets a little frayed and a little burned. If this happens, you can take some 240 sandpaper and sand it down to remove any burrs and the burn marks. Repeat this process as needed. Now I'm going to pick out some clip art for the face of the clock. I kind of like the way the mountains and pines look. I'm going to go ahead and open up my template here. Now I'm going to find my mountains and pines logo and I'm going to scale it to fit. Once I have it where I like it, I can go ahead and set the printer up to print the layers that I need. I want to make sure I'm printing the right colors and they're at the right power, speed, and PPI settings. Once I'm done, I can hit print and let it go. Now I'm going to do some quick sanding to remove any burn marks left behind by the laser. With our part C now dry, I'm going to quickly sand them on the belt sander just to take off the majority of the material that I don't need. I want to be very careful on the belt sander not to sand off too much material. If I make these too short, the clock face won't fit inside them. To wrap up part C, I want to use a roundover bit to round the 2 front edges on both pieces. Before gluing anything together, make sure you do a quick test fit just to make sure it fits how you want it. If everything looks good, you can start by gluing the face of the clock to part C. We're going to use the dados to hold the face in place. Just like we did on the inlays, we're going to insert a bit of glue into the groove, and then we're going to clamp the face inside the groove to hold it tight. It's very important when you're doing this step to wipe up any excess glue, because in these tight corners it can be really hard to sand down later. With the glue finally dry, we're just going to give it a quick sanding just to make sure all the glue is removed. Again, if you wipe the glue down pretty good, you should have very little to sand off. Now we can start installing part B to the clock. To do this, we're going to need a measuring tool, some blocks, some clamps, and then we're going to finish up with adding some brad nails for extra strength. First, I'm going to start by putting a little bit of glue to the top and bottom of part C. Take your time when lining up part B. Make sure to take multiple measurements multiple times to make sure nothing shifts while you're clamping it. Once the glue is dry, we can follow up with some brad nails. When doing brad nails, I like to just give myself a little target, especially with a space so small such as this. So I'm just going to line up my marks and put a little dot where I want the brad nail to go. With any luck, I won't shoot anything through the side, but just in case, you always want to keep your hand clear of where you're nailing. That way if the nail does go through the side of the wood, it won't hit you. Despite my best efforts, one nail must have hit a tough piece of wood and it diverted from its path. So I'm going to have to fix that before I finish the clock. Now we're going to install part A using glue. You want to make sure that the routed edges are facing inward towards the face of the clock. Just like with part B, make sure you measure frequently to make sure nothing moves around while you're trying to clamp it. Unlike part B, we're not going to be using brad nails for part A, we're just using glue. Once part A is dry, we can start applying our wipe-on poly. You're going to need 2 rags, one for the poly and one to wipe off any sawdust left behind on the clock. You want to make sure everything is removed and you have a nice clean surface to accept the poly. Just like the instructions say on the can, I'm going to shake it vigorously to make sure it's all ready to go. And I'm going to use a screwdriver to open the lid. The wipe-on poly is pretty easy to apply. You just add it to a cloth and you can wipe it on. Since our hands are going to be in direct contact with the cloth, you definitely want to wear gloves. This type of poly is really easy to apply, and you can just apply more to the rag as you need it. You want to make sure you keep a pretty saturated rag. That way you can push more poly into the tight corners on the clock. A wipe-on poly like this eliminates the risk of having brush strokes, and it also protects and seals the wood. You want to apply 2 to 3 coats of this poly, allowing the poly to dry between each coat. Lastly, we can install our clock mechanism. We're going to put this rubber washer onto the clock body itself, which is where you can put the battery, change the time, and hang it on the wall. The clock body goes on the back side of the clock, and you just put it inside the center hole on the clock face. Next, we can install the washer and nut to hold it in place. Next, we can install the hour hand and the minute hand. Before installing these, we need to remove a small little film with our fingernail. Once this film is off, we can install each hand. The hour hand goes on first and just pushes in place. Once that's snugly on, you can put the minute hand on, and we're going to use the cap to hold that in place. There's a small little gold washer that never seems to fit with this kit, so I don't use it. The cap does a good job holding the minute hand in place all by itself. Using that little turn dial on the back, I can hold it in place to make sure the hand doesn't turn when I'm trying to tighten it. Now, each hand should move freely as you turn the dial on the back. This dial is how you set the clock, but to keep the time, you need to make sure to install a AA battery. Here is our finished clock. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching.